On August 12, 2024, around 9:15 in the morning, Marcus Chen was working on the 5th floor of the Whitmore Memorial Library at Ashford University in central Massachusetts. The building had been closed to students for 8 months, while contractors converted the 1928 Gothic Revival structure into what the university called an innovation and digital learning center. Chen, a restoration carpenter with Heritage Woodworks of Boston, had spent the previous 3 weeks carefully dismantling oak paneling and mahogany built-ins that would be preserved and reinstalled in the new design. The restricted archives wing on the 5th floor contained the building's most elaborate original features. Chen had been tasked with assessing a massive decorative globe that stood in the center of what had once been the Special Collections reading room. The globe measured nearly 8 feet in diameter and rested on an ornate wooden stand that brought its total height to 12 feet. According to the work order, the university wanted to know if the piece could be moved intact or would need to be disassembled. Chen ran his hand along the globe's surface, feeling the raised textures of mountain ranges molded into the plaster sphere. The continents were rendered in faded greens and browns, the oceans in a blue that had darkened over decades to something closer to navy. He noticed something unusual about the southern hemisphere. While the northern sections of the globe showed their age through cracks and yellowed varnish, a portion of the South Pacific appeared different. The surface there seemed smoother, less weathered. Chen pressed his palm against the area near New Zealand and felt the slightest give, as if the material had more flexibility than the surrounding plaster. He called over his supervisor, a woman named Janet Reese who had worked on historical building restoration for 23 years. Reese brought a stepladder and examined the spot Chen had indicated. She took out a small flashlight and held it at an angle to the surface. In the raking light, they could both see a faint seam, barely visible, running in a rough rectangle about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. Reese touched the edge of the seam with her fingernail and felt it catch slightly. She looked at Chen and then back at the globe. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Reese descended the ladder and made a phone call to the university's facilities director. Within 40 minutes, 3 people had arrived at the 5th floor. The facilities director, a woman from the university archives department, and a man who identified himself as the assistant to the university president. They stood in a semicircle around the globe, while Reese explained what she and Chen had found. The assistant to the president, a precise man in his early 40s named David Milhouse, asked if they were certain it was a seam, and not simply a repair from decades ago. Reese said she was certain. The material inside the seam felt different from the surrounding plaster. It felt, she said, like it might be wood. Milhouse made a call. He spoke quietly, mostly listening, occasionally saying yes or no. When he ended the call, he turned to the group and said the university president wanted them to proceed with opening whatever this was, but to document everything carefully. The woman from the archives department, whose name was Claire Voss, began taking photographs with a professional camera. Chen and Reese put on work gloves and began to probe the edges of the seam more deliberately. What they discovered was a latch mechanism, hidden so cleverly in the carved decorative elements of the globe's stand that it appeared to be nothing more than part of the ornamental design. The latch was located on the southern side of the base, worked into what looked like a carved wooden wave pattern. When Reese pressed a specific section of the carving, they heard a click from somewhere inside the globe above them. The rectangular section of the southern hemisphere shifted outward by perhaps half an inch. Reese and Chen carefully pulled the section open. It swung outward on hinges that, despite decades without maintenance, moved smoothly and quietly. The opening revealed darkness inside the sphere. Reese shone her flashlight into the space and then stepped back. She handed the flashlight to Milhouse without saying anything. He directed the beam inside and his face changed. He lowered the flashlight and looked at Claire Voss. He said they needed to call the police immediately. Inside the globe was a small room, roughly spherical, following the interior curve of the structure. The space measured approximately 6 feet in diameter at its widest point, It contained a wooden chair, a small folding desk attached to the interior wall, and the skeletal remains of a human being seated at the desk. The skeleton was still clothed in the remnants of a wool suit. On the desk in front of the remains sat a leather document folder, a fountain pen, and what appeared to be a brass kerosene lamp. Every surface was covered in a fine layer of dust that had somehow settled inside the sealed space over the course of decades. The Ashford Police Department arrived within 20 minutes. 2 patrol officers secured the scene and waited for detectives. By 11:30 that morning, the 5th floor of Whitmore Memorial Library had been cordoned off with police tape. Detective Sarah Kowalski of the Ashford Police, who had been with the department for 16 years, stood outside the Globe with a crime scene photographer and a representative from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Scene Services. The photographer took over 100 images before anyone touched anything inside the sphere. The medical examiner arrived just after noon. Dr. Philip Grant had served as the chief medical examiner for the county for the past 9 years and had seen his share of unusual death scenes, but he admitted later that he had never encountered anything quite like this. The body showed no signs of obvious trauma. The skeleton sat upright in the chair, the spine curved slightly forward in what looked like a natural seated posture. The skull rested at an angle that suggested the person had been looking down at the desk when death occurred. The right hand, now just bones held together by dried remnants of ligament, and the sleeve of the suit jacket, rested on the document folder. Detective Kowalski photographed the folder before anyone moved it. The leather was dark brown, aged but surprisingly intact given the conditions. Embossed on the front in gold lettering that had mostly flaked away were the words, Whitmore Memorial Library, and below that, Special Collections. She carefully lifted the folder, supporting it from beneath, and carried it out of the Globe to a table that had been set up in the reading room. She opened it with gloved hands. Inside the folder were 3 items. The first was a typed letter on university letterhead, dated October 29, 1954. The second was a handwritten journal entry on lined paper, undated. The third was a black and white photograph of a man and woman standing in front of the Globe itself, taken when the Globe was clearly new and the reading room was in active use. The letter was addressed to the Board of Trustees of Ashford University. It was signed by Dr. Edmund Price, lead archivist. The letter began with a confession. Whitmore Memorial Library had been built in 1928 with funding from the Whitmore family, wealthy industrialists who had made their fortune in textile manufacturing. The library was designed by the architectural firm of Hammond and Cross of New York City, one of the most prestigious firms of the era. The building featured elaborate stonework, hand-carved woodwork, stained glass windows, and numerous decorative elements meant to showcase the grandeur appropriate to an institution of higher learning. The crown jewel of the building was the Special Collections reading room on the 5th floor, a space reserved for researchers working with the university's rare books and historical documents. The centerpiece of that room was the Master Globe, commissioned specifically for Whitmore Memorial Library and constructed by the Cartographic Arts Company of Philadelphia. The Globe took 18 months to build and cost the equivalent of nearly $200,000 in today's currency. It was delivered to the library in sections in October of 1928 and assembled on site. The Globe was not simply decorative. It was designed as a functional research tool with meticulous cartographic detail and the ability to rotate on its axis. The interior of the Globe, however, was something else entirely. According to Edmund Price's letter, the Globe's interior had been designed as a secret space from the beginning. The architect, a man named Harrison Cross, had incorporated the hidden chamber as a kind of elaborate joke, a secret known only to himself and a few members of the Whitmore family. The space was meant to be a curiosity, perhaps used for storing particularly valuable documents, or simply left as an Easter egg for some future generation to discover. Harrison Cross died in 1931 without having told anyone outside the immediate project team about the chamber. The Whitmore family members who knew about it passed away in the decades that followed. By the early 1950s, no one at Ashford University had any idea the chamber existed. No one, that is, except Edmund Price. Edmund Frederick Price was born in Hartford, Connecticut in August of 1902. He was the second son of Robert and Margaret Price, who owned a small bookbinding and printing business. Edmund showed an early aptitude for languages and history. He attended Yale University on a partial scholarship, graduating in 1924 with a degree in European history. He continued his studies at Columbia University, earning a master's degree in library science in 1927. He married Elizabeth Vaughan in June of 1928. They had one daughter, Catherine, born in 1930. Price joined the staff of Whitmore Memorial Library in September of 1928, just as the building was nearing completion. He was hired as an assistant archivist, working under the library's first director, a scholar named Thomas Ashford, who was a distant cousin of the university's founding family. Price proved to be meticulous in his work, with a particular talent for cataloging and preservation. He was promoted to senior archivist in 1936 and became lead archivist in 1947 when Thomas Ashford retired. Colleagues described Price as quiet and intensely private. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, with a slender build and thinning brown hair that he combed straight back from his forehead. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and favored dark wool suits, always with a vest. Even in warm weather, he walked with a slight limp, the result of a childhood injury to his left leg. He drove a 1949 Plymouth Special Deluxe, dark green, which he kept meticulously maintained. He ate lunch every day at 12:15, usually a sandwich he brought from home, which he ate at his desk in the archives workroom. Price had few close friends. He belonged to no clubs or organizations outside of his professional library associations. His life centered on his work and his family. His daughter Catherine recalled him as a devoted father who read to her every night when she was young and who took great interest in her education. He helped her with her homework, particularly in history and literature, and encouraged her to pursue college. Elizabeth Price, his wife, told investigators years later that Edmund rarely spoke about his work in specific terms. He came home each evening at 5:45. He had dinner with his family. He read in the study until 10 o'clock and then went to bed. On the night of October 29, 1954, Edmund Price told his wife he needed to return to the library to complete some cataloging work that had a deadline the following day. This was not unusual. Price occasionally worked late, particularly during the academic year when special collections saw more use. He left his home on Birch Street at 7:30 that evening. Elizabeth Price never saw her husband again. Price did not return home that night. Elizabeth called the library the following morning and spoke to the circulation desk supervisor, who said she had not seen Dr. Price yet that day. Elizabeth waited until noon and then called the university security office. A guard went to check Price's office in the archives wing. The office was locked. The guard used his master key to open it. The office was empty. Everything appeared to be in its normal place. Price's coat hung on the coat rack behind the door. His briefcase sat on the floor beside his desk. Elizabeth Price filed a missing person report with the Ashford Police Department that evening. Officers interviewed library staff, university administrators, and the Price family's neighbors. No one had seen Edmund Price since he left his home on the evening of October 29th. His car was found in the library parking lot 2 days later. The keys were not in the vehicle. A search of the library building and grounds was conducted over the course of a week. Police checked every room, every closet, every storage space. They found nothing. The investigation continued for 3 months. Police interviewed hundreds of people connected to the university. They examined Price's financial records and found nothing unusual. His bank accounts showed regular deposits of his salary and modest withdrawals for household expenses. He had no debts. He had no known enemies. He had no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. He simply vanished. The case went cold. Elizabeth Price waited. She kept the house exactly as it had been. She continued to set a place for Edmund at the dinner table for the first year, though she removed it eventually at Catherine's urging. Catherine Price graduated from high school in 1955 and attended Wellesley College. She visited her mother every weekend. In 1963, Elizabeth Price sold the house on Birch Street and moved to a smaller apartment. She died in 1978 of heart disease. She never learned what happened to her husband. Catherine Price married in 1964 and moved to Oregon. She had 2 sons. She returned to Massachusetts occasionally to visit friends and to attend university functions. She maintained hope that her father's disappearance would someday be explained, but as decades passed, that hope faded. In 2024, Catherine Price was 94 years old and living in an assisted care facility in Portland. When the Ashford Police Department contacted her about the discovery in the Globe, she asked them to repeat what they had said. She listened silently while Detective Kowalski explained what they had found. After a long pause, Catherine asked if her father had suffered. Kowalski told her the evidence suggested he had not. The letter Edmund Price left in the document folder explained much, though not everything. Price wrote that he had discovered the chamber inside the Globe by accident in 1952. He had been cataloging a collection of architectural drawings donated to the library by the estate of Harrison Cross's business partner. Among the drawings were detailed specifications for Whitmore Memorial Library, including a cutaway diagram of the Globe that clearly showed the hidden chamber and the mechanism for accessing it. Price was fascinated. He spent weeks studying the drawings, confirming details of the Globe's construction that matched what he could observe from the outside. In March of 1953, Price found the hidden latch for the first time. He opened the chamber and climbed inside, using a stepladder to reach the opening. The interior took his breath away. The curved walls gave him the sensation of being inside the world itself, protected and separate. He brought a battery powered lantern and sat in the chamber for 20 minutes, overwhelmed by the feeling of enclosure and safety. He returned the next night, and the night after that. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into cold cases and historical mysteries. Price wrote that the chamber became an obsession. He began spending hours inside it. Late at night after the library closed, he brought in the chair and the small desk. He brought books and papers. He brought a kerosene lamp because he preferred its warm light to the harsh beam of the battery lantern. He felt, he wrote, more himself inside the chamber than he had ever felt anywhere in his life. The curved walls muffled sound from the outside world. He could think clearly. He could work without interruption. He could exist in a state of perfect focus. He knew it was not rational. He acknowledged that in the letter. But he also wrote that he did not care. For the first time in his 52 years, he had found a space that felt entirely his own. He had spent his life in service to others, to his family, to his profession, to the institution. Inside the Globe, he belonged to no one but himself. The handwritten journal entry was dated October 29, 1954. It was written in the chamber. Price described his evening. He had told Elizabeth he needed to work late, which was true. He had work to complete. But he also knew when he left home that evening that he was not planning to return. He had been planning this for months, he wrote. He had prepared carefully. He had brought enough food and water to last a week. He had brought blankets. He had brought a small camping stove and fuel. He had tested the air circulation in the chamber and found it adequate, though not generous. He planned to stay in the chamber for 6 days. During that time, he would be reported missing. A search would be conducted. Police would investigate. And then, after 6 days, he would emerge. He would claim to have suffered some kind of breakdown, a fugue state, a period of amnesia. He would express confusion and regret. He would submit to medical evaluation. And then he would resign from his position. And he and Elizabeth would move away from Ashford, perhaps to another state entirely. He would start over in a place where he was not known, where he had no obligations, where he could simply exist. The journal entry ended there, Mid-page, the final sentence incomplete. Price had written, "The lamp is burning lower than I expected, and the air seems." The forensic analysis conducted by the Massachusetts State Police determined the cause of death to be carbon monoxide poisoning. The kerosene lamp Price had been using consumed oxygen and produced carbon monoxide in the enclosed space. The chamber, while not completely airtight, had insufficient ventilation for the lamp to burn safely. Price would have become drowsy as the carbon monoxide levels increased. He would have lost consciousness before he realized what was happening. Death would have followed within minutes. The medical examiner estimated Price had been dead for approximately 6 to 8 hours when the lamp finally exhausted its fuel and went out. By that time, the carbon monoxide had dissipated through the small gaps in the globe's construction that allowed for minimal air exchange. When the chamber was opened 70 years later, the air inside was stale but not toxic. Price's watch, a Hamilton watch with a leather band that had long since deteriorated, had stopped at 3:27. Whether that was morning or afternoon could not be determined, but investigators believed it was most likely early morning of October 30th, 1954, given the timeline Price had described in his journal. The investigation into Price's death was relatively brief. There was no evidence of foul play. The manner of death was determined to be accidental. The chamber had been Price's own refuge, entered voluntarily, and his death was the tragic result of a miscalculation about the safety of burning a kerosene lamp in a confined space. The case was closed within 2 months. The university president issued a statement expressing sorrow over the tragic end to a mystery that had haunted the institution for 70 years. Catherine Price's family released a statement thanking the police and the university for their professionalism and for finally providing answers. Catherine herself declined to give interviews, releasing only a written statement that read, "My father was a good man who loved his work and his family. I am grateful to finally know what happened to him, and I choose to remember him as he was in life, not as he was found." The question of why Price chose to hide in the globe, why he felt compelled to disappear, remained more difficult to answer. Psychologists consulted by investigators suggested Price may have been suffering from severe anxiety or depression, conditions that were poorly understood and rarely diagnosed in the 1950s. His need for isolation, for a space entirely his own, might have reflected a level of psychological distress that he had kept hidden from everyone in his life. Price's letter and journal suggested a man who felt overwhelmed by obligation, by the weight of other people's expectations and needs. The chamber represented escape, but not in the conventional sense. He did not want to leave his life behind permanently. He wanted to step outside it temporarily, to experience a kind of suspension, and then to return on his own terms. The tragedy was that his careful plan was undermined by a simple, fatal miscalculation. The globe itself became the subject of much discussion. The university considered dismantling it and removing it from the library building, but ultimately decided to preserve it as part of the building's historical record. The chamber was left intact but sealed permanently. A plaque was installed in the reading room explaining the globe's history and commemorating Edmund Price. The university donated his personal effects found in the chamber, including his fountain pen and the document folder, to the Ashford Historical Society, where they remain on display. Elizabeth Price's belongings, which Catherine had kept in storage for decades, were examined by researchers with Catherine's permission. Among Elizabeth's papers was a diary she had kept sporadically over the years, an entry from October of 1954, written several days after Edmund's disappearance, read, "I keep thinking he will walk through the door. I keep imagining reasons why he would have left. I cannot believe he would do this to us intentionally. But I also cannot shake the feeling that wherever he is, he wanted to go there." The library renovation was completed in 2025. The 5th floor, once the Special Collections Reading Room, became a digital collaboration space with modern furniture and computer workstations. The globe remained, now behind protective plexiglass, a monument to a different era and to the man who found refuge inside it. Students pass it daily, most unaware of the story it contains. Marcus Chen, the carpenter who discovered the hidden latch, told reporters he thinks about Edmund Price often. He wonders what it must have felt like in those final hours, sealed inside the globe with the lamp burning down and the air growing thin. He wonders if Price realized what was happening, if he tried to open the chamber from the inside and found he could not, or if he simply fell asleep believing he would wake up in the morning ready to execute the next phase of his plan. The photograph found in the document folder showed Edmund and Elizabeth Price standing in front of the globe, likely taken in the early 1930s when the library was still new and Edmund was beginning his career. They are both smiling, Edmund with his arm around Elizabeth's waist. Behind them, the globe looms large, its continents and oceans perfectly rendered, its hidden secret invisible to the camera. It is impossible to look at the photograph now without seeing it as a kind of foreshadowing, though of course, when the photograph was taken, the globe was simply an impressive piece of cartographic art, and Edmund Price was simply a young archivist with his whole future ahead of him. Catherine Price requested that her father be buried next to her mother in Ashford Cemetery. A small private service was held in November of 2024, attended by fewer than a dozen people. Catherine, who made the trip from Oregon despite her age and declining health, placed a single white rose on the casket. She told one of the attending relatives that she believed her father had been looking for peace, and that, in his own way, he had found it. Whether that peace lasted 6 hours or 6 days, or only a few moments before the lamp consumed the oxygen he needed to survive, was something no one could know. The case of Edmund Price closes not with answers to every question, but with the stark image of a man sitting at a small desk inside a hollow globe, writing by lamplight, believing he was executing a careful plan that would give him control over his own life for the first time. The cruelty of his death lies not in malice or violence, but in simple miscalculation. He brought everything he thought he needed into that chamber, everything except enough air. Whitmore Memorial Library stands on the Ashford University campus as it has for nearly a century, its Gothic Revival spires visible from across the town. Inside, students study and collaborate, and access information from around the world through glowing screens. On the 5th floor, encased in plexiglass, the master globe remains, its painted oceans faded, its continents worn by time. Somewhere in the South Pacific, invisible unless you know exactly where to look, a seam marks the entrance to a chamber that once held a man who wanted nothing more than to disappear into a world of his own making. The globe still turns on its axis, if you know how to make it move, rotating slowly under the weight of all the history it has absorbed, all the secrets it has kept,